The Bourbon Dynasty. For over 2 centuries, the House of Bourbon ruled France with the kind of absolute, untouchable authority that made kings feel genuinely ordained by God. Versailles was their monument to that belief. A palace so outrageously gilded, so deliberately overwhelming in its scale and opulence, that visiting diplomats were meant to feel small by design. It worked, until it didn't. By the late 18th century, France was drowning in debt, a significant portion of which had been accumulated by funding the American Revolution, a choice that would prove darkly ironic, given that France was essentially bankrolling a Republican uprising abroad while sitting on a powder keg at home. Bread prices soared. Harvests failed. Ordinary French people were starving in the streets outside a palace where the chandeliers alone cost more than most villages earned in a decade. King Louis XVI, who inherited this catastrophe, was by most historical accounts a decent man trapped in entirely the wrong century. He was indecisive, slow to act, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of bold political maneuvering the moment demanded. When the revolution erupted in 1789, he repeatedly hesitated at precisely the moments when a harder king might have crushed it. Instead, he was stripped of his absolute power, then stripped of his freedom, then stripped of his crown entirely, as the monarchy was abolished and the royal family was imprisoned. The political temperature kept rising, and by 1793, it had reached the point where putting a king on trial for treason against his own people was not only imaginable, but popular. Found guilty, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine on January 21, 1793. The guillotine was chosen specifically because it was clinical, mechanical, and equal, a device that made no distinction between a peasant's neck and a royal one. His wife, Marie Antoinette, who had become the most hated symbol of aristocratic excess in France regardless of how fair that reputation actually was, followed him to the same blade 9 months later. The absolute Bourbon monarchy, centuries in the making, ended not with a siege or a battlefield defeat, but with a machine and a crowd. The Mughal dynasty. At their peak, the Mughals governed nearly the entire Indian subcontinent, and did so with a level of cultural and artistic sophistication that still defines the region centuries later. They built the Taj Mahal. They commanded personal treasuries that made European monarchs look modestly comfortable by comparison. The empire stretched across modern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, governing hundreds of millions of people under a system that, at its height, was genuinely cosmopolitan for its era. But empires don't collapse at their peak, they collapse during the long, slow decline that follows it. By the mid-19th century, the British East India Company had methodically absorbed Mughal territory piece by piece over the course of roughly a century, until the last emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, controlled nothing beyond the walls of the Red Fort in Delhi. He was given a British pension. He was 82 years old, a Sufi mystic and accomplished Urdu poet, and he had approximately zero interest in leading a military uprising. Then, 1857 happened. Indian soldiers, sepoys, revolted against British colonial rule in what became known as the Indian Rebellion, and the rebels marched to Delhi looking for a symbol to unite behind. They chose Zafar, and the old poet emperor, understanding he had little real choice, gave his blessing to the uprising. When the British crushed the rebellion with overwhelming and deliberate brutality, their response to the Mughal dynasty was total. British officers arrested Zafar, then captured his sons and grandson, and shot them in cold blood to ensure that no male heir could ever reclaim the throne. Zafar himself was put on trial for treason inside his own palace, the same palace his ancestors had built to project imperial majesty. Found guilty, stripped of every title, and exiled to Rangoon in Burma, where he spent his final years in a thatched mud hut, and died in 1862, in complete obscurity. More than 300 years of Mughal rule ended not in a palace but in a hut, with a poet who never wanted the fight in the first place. The Qing dynasty. The Qing emperors ruled from within the Forbidden City, under the divine authority of the Mandate of Heaven, a political and religious concept that framed imperial rule, not as a human arrangement, but as a cosmic one, meaning that questioning the emperor was not merely treasonous, but metaphysically disordered. At their height in the 18th century, the Qing governed roughly a third of the world's entire population and presided over an empire that many historians consider the wealthiest on earth at the time. Then came the 19th century, and with it the Opium Wars, humiliating unequal treaties forced on China by European powers, the catastrophic Taiping Rebellion, which killed somewhere between 20 and 30 million people in the 1850s and 60s, and an imperial court so committed to Confucian tradition that it actively resisted every meaningful attempt to modernize. By 1908, the dynasty was so hollowed out that when an emperor was needed, the court placed a 2-year-old boy named Puyi on the dragon throne. A toddler sat on the most ancient seat of power in the world's most populous nation, and nobody in the palace apparently recognized this as a sign that things had gone badly wrong. The Xinhai Revolution erupted in 1911, driven by Republican forces who wanted to demolish not just the Qing dynasty, but the entire 2,000-year institution of Chinese imperial rule in a single stroke. On February 12, 1912, the child emperor Puyi was forced to abdicate, and 2 millennia of unbroken imperial Chinese governance ended with a piece of paper signed on behalf of a 6-year-old. Puyi's subsequent life reads like a fever dream of the 20th century's worst convulsions. Kept as a ceremonial prisoner in his own palace through the 1920s, then installed by invading Japanese forces as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo during World War II, then captured by the Soviet Union at the war's end, then handed to the Chinese Communist Party, who put him through re-education and eventually released him to live out his final years as an ordinary gardener and citizen in Beijing. He died in 1967. The man who had once been son of heaven died trimming plants. The Habsburg Dynasty. The Habsburgs didn't build their empire primarily through military conquest, they built it through marriage. Their unofficial motto, attributed to the dynasty for centuries, was essentially, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." It worked spectacularly. At their peak, the Habsburgs simultaneously controlled Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, and significant portions of Italy, all stitched together through generations of calculated matrimonial diplomacy. By the early 20th century, what remained was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, vast, multi-ethnic, internally fractious, holding together Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croatians, and dozens of other groups under a single crown that none of them felt entirely represented them. The catalyst arrived on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a Habsburg heir, was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. The dynasty had, through the chain of alliances it had helped construct, effectively triggered the First World War. The war tore the empire apart from the inside. Every ethnic group within it saw the catastrophe as an opportunity for independence, and by 1918, the empire didn't so much collapse as dissolve. Individual nations simply declared themselves independent overnight, and the empire ceased to exist before anyone formally ended it. Emperor Charles I, who had inherited this disintegrating situation in 1916, at age 29, refused to formally abdicate even as everything fell away. He declared his sovereign rights indivisible, a statement of princely dignity that the new Austrian Republic found entirely unpersuasive. They simply banned him from the country, seized all Habsburg properties, and exiled him. Charles ended up on the remote Atlantic island of Madeira, where he died of pneumonia in 1922, at just 34 years old, in a modest house, surrounded by a family that had gone from ruling half of Europe to owning almost nothing in the span of 4 years. The Hohenzollern dynasty. The Hohenzollerns built their reputation on military discipline, territorial expansion, and the unflinching belief that Prussia, and later Germany, should be the dominant power in Europe. It worked. Over roughly 2 centuries, they transformed a minor northern German state into a European superpower, unifying the German Empire in 1871 under Kaiser Wilhelm I, after a series of short, decisive wars that humiliated Austria and then France in quick succession. The problem was Kaiser Wilhelm II, who inherited this powerful, tightly wound machine in 1888 and proceeded to operate it with the subtlety of a man who had never been told no. Wilhelm was the grandson of both Queen Victoria of Britain and Emperor Wilhelm I of Germany, connected by blood to virtually every royal house in Europe, and still managed to alienate almost all of them. He dismissed Bismarck, the architect of German diplomatic stability, almost immediately after taking power. He launched a massive naval buildup that directly threatened Britain. His erratic, aggressive foreign policy dismantled the careful alliance architecture that had kept Europe in relative balance for decades and replaced it with the rigid, catastrophic system of entanglements that made a single assassination in Sarajevo sufficient to ignite a continental war. By November 1918, Germany was finished. Military collapse on the Western Front, civilian starvation caused by British naval blockades, and a full-scale domestic revolution spreading from the naval base at Kiel through factories and city streets. Wilhelm's generals gathered and delivered the news with quiet finality. The army would not fight for him. His abdication was announced publicly in Berlin on November 9, 1918, without his formal prior consent. He crossed into the neutral Netherlands the following day, aboard a private train, and never returned. He spent the rest of his life at Doorn House in the Dutch countryside, where he reportedly spent hours each day chopping wood. A man who had commanded the most powerful military in Europe, reduced to splitting logs as a hobby. He was still alive in June 1940, when German forces rolled through France, and according to historians, sent Hitler a congratulatory telegram. He died in exile in 1941, having outlasted his empire by 23 years. The Ottoman dynasty, 600 years. That is how long the House of Osman held power. Longer than the Western Roman Empire, longer than the Byzantine Empire it replaced, longer than any dynasty in this video by a significant margin. At their peak in the 16th century, the Ottomans controlled territory stretching from Hungary in the northwest to the Persian Gulf in the southeast, to Algeria in the west, governing an empire that spanned 3 continents and served as the bridge between Europe and Asia for centuries. The decline was slow, painful, and visible to everyone except the people most motivated to reverse it. By the 19th century, European diplomats were already calling the empire the sick man of Europe, a phrase attributed to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia around 1853. Nationalist movements were steadily peeling away territories. Greece in the 1820s, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania in the decades that followed. The administrative machinery was creaking under its own weight. Then Sultan Mehmed VI made the decision that sealed the dynasty's fate, aligning the Ottoman Empire with the Central Powers in World War I, a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. The empire was decisively defeated, Allied forces occupied Istanbul in 1918, and the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 proposed carving Ottoman territories into pieces, distributed among the victorious powers and newly independent nations. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a military commander who had become a national hero at Gallipoli, launched a war of independence that rejected both the Allied occupation and the Sultan's government, which he characterized as a collaborationist shell serving foreign interests. Ataturk won. The Turkish Grand National Assembly voted to abolish the Sultanate on November 1, 1922, and Mehmed VI, understanding clearly what happened to rulers who overstayed their welcome in revolutionary climates, did not wait around to find out if the vote was symbolic. On November 17, 1922, he slipped out of his palace in Istanbul and boarded a British warship, leaving the city and the empire he nominally ruled forever. He died in San Remo, Italy, in 1926, in a hotel. A man whose title once encompassed Caliph of Islam and Shadow of God on earth, died in a Mediterranean hotel. The caliphate itself, held by the Ottoman sultans for centuries, was formally abolished by the new Turkish Republic in March 1924, bringing the last formal connection to the old empire to an end. The Romanov dynasty. The Romanovs had survived 3 centuries of palace coups, assassination attempts, and popular uprisings through a combination of autocratic force and an almost mystical grip on the Russian national imagination. The idea that Russia needed a czar felt, to millions of people, as natural and inevitable as winter. Nicholas II, who took the throne in 1894, was in many ways personally admirable, devoted father, deeply religious, genuinely kind in private life. He was also catastrophically unsuited to lead a vast empire through the early 20th century's upheavals. He believed in absolute autocracy with a sincere religious conviction, at precisely the moment when autocracies across Europe were failing under the pressure of industrialization, nationalism, and mass politics. World War I broke the dynasty faster than any internal enemy could have managed. Russian forces suffered millions of casualties in campaigns characterized by staggering mismanagement. Soldiers were sometimes sent to the front without rifles, instructed to pick up weapons from the dead. The home front collapsed under food shortages and runaway inflation. By February 1917, bread riots in Petrograd escalated into a full revolution within days, and when Nicholas ordered soldiers to fire on the crowds, many of them refused and defected to the protesters instead. He abdicated in March 1917, and the three-century Romanov reign ended without a single battle. The Bolsheviks, who seized power in October 1917, understood immediately that a living Romanov was a permanent rallying point for counter-revolution. Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, were moved east, eventually confined to the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, deep in the Urals. As anti-Bolshevik forces closed in on the city in July 1918, the local Bolshevik commander received orders from Moscow. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the family was woken and led down to the basement under the pretense of a safety photograph, while the chaos outside settled. A firing squad entered the room. The initial volley did not kill everyone. Some of the children had jewels sewn into the lining of their corsets, which deflected bullets, and the executioners finished the work with bayonets and rifle butts. The bodies were taken to a mine shaft outside the city, doused in acid, and burned. It was not discovered until decades later, and not fully identified until DNA analysis in the 1990s confirmed what historians already knew. Of all the dynasties in this video, the Romanovs are the only one whose end took place in a basement, in the dark, with children. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.